The galaxy is full of small, fragile illusions. The grandest of them all is the belief that a uniform makes a defender, or that a crown gives a man courage. In the glittering core sectors of the Alien Empire, safety was nothing more than a royal performance. It was paraded down pristine planetary boulevards in the form of towering solar gold dreadnoughts, their hulls polished to a mirror shine to reflect the light of 3 suns. The royal commanders spoke in booming tones across the hypernet, assuring trillions of citizens that the Empire's shield was absolute. They called themselves the Sentinels of the Starlight. But out here on the rim, on worlds like Horizon's Edge, we knew the truth about velvet and iron. Velvet looks beautiful until it catches fire, and iron doesn't care about royal ciphers. When the sky actually turned into a bleeding horizon of plasma and kinetic slugs, the golden ships didn't stand and fight. They pulled their anchors up, dumped the dead weight of billions of ordinary civilians, and vanished into the slipstream. They left the galaxy to burn, leaving behind the very people they swore to protect. And that is exactly where a human freight hauler named Jax Carter decided that running wasn't a cost-effective option. Jax rubbed a heavy, calloused hand across the back of his neck, his fingers picking up a thick residue of synthetic valve lubricant and dry heat soot. The air inside the hangar of Landing Bay 9G was thick, heavy with the metallic temps of ionizing atmospheric shields and the distinct, sulfurous odor of a world being cooked from orbit. This vibration wasn't the rhythmic, comforting thrum of his own ship-a massive, blocky, triple-hulled star freighter named the Iron Vanguard, warming up its secondary core. No, this vibration was a structural death rattle. The orbital bombardment from the predatory Vol Dominion had been going on for 47 minutes, and the planetary shields over the capital city of Solis Prime were already turning a sickly, unstable shade of dark violet, knowing the atmospheric pressure doors wouldn't hold much longer. Jax adjusted his heavy hydraulic wrench around the primary fuel line of the Iron Vanguard's starboard thruster bank. He was a massive individual, built like an industrial bulkhead himself, with broad, rounded shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved out of an asteroid by a dull chisel. With a low grunt, he threw his entire weight into the wrench, locking the pressure seal into place until the metal hissed in submission. He tossed the tool into a worn, dented metal crate where it landed with a sharp, heavy clatter. "Okay, don't disappoint me today, you old slab of rust," Jax muttered, striking his closed fist against the dark, unpainted hull of the freighter. "We've got a long flight ahead." He scrambled down the structural scaffold, his heavy work boots echoing sharply against the grated metal floor plates as he made his way toward the bridge elevator. Jax walked up the main loading ramp of his ship, the heavy hydraulic pistons groaning under the weight as the heavy blast doors sealed shut behind him, cutting off the deafening noise of the burning city outside. The interior of the Iron Vanguard was an ugly, utilitarian paradise. It smelled of stale synthetic coffee, burning copper wires, and the deep, rich grease of old sublight engines. Jax settled his massive frame into the worn, cracked pilot seat. His large, thick fingers moved across the manual control board with unexpected, fluid speed, flicking heavy breaker switches based on pure muscle memory. The secondary monitors flickered to life, bathing his face in a cold, green data glow. The tactical radar map was a complete disaster area. The Vol fleet was a dense grid of red geometric symbols, methodically descending from the upper atmosphere like a swarm of iron locusts. Jax reached out and keyed the ship's long-range comms array, tuning the receiver to the open military and evacuation frequencies to gauge the traffic near the orbital elevator. Instead of disciplined coordination, what spilled out of the speakers was a raw, terrifying wave of absolute chaos and uncontrolled panic. "The defensive wall at Sector 7 has fractured. We need immediate air support. They aren't taking prisoners." Another voice broke through, distorted by heavy atmospheric static. "This is Evacuation Shuttle 3 Alpha. We are taking heavy fire. Our engines are failing. Is anyone left in the sky? Jax stared at the console for a single, frozen second, then slammed his palm against the mute toggle. The sudden silence that filled the cockpit was heavy, almost suffocating. He leaned forward, propping his elbows on the console, and pulled up the high-altitude optical tracking logs to sweep the space beyond the burning thermosphere. He found the Third Fleet, 55 state-of-the-art Royal cruisers, HULLs, lined with silver plating and armed with the finest antimatter cannons money could buy, were clustered high above the combat zone. They were supposed to be the immortal fist of the Emperor, but they weren't moving toward the enemy. Their primary guidance vectors were aligned completely away from the planet, pointed straight toward the deep, empty space of the outer rim. Jax watched in cold, flat disbelief as the automated telemetry readings updated on his secondary screen. The energy spikes coming from the Royal cruisers were massive. Their slipspace drives were spooling up to maximum capacity simultaneously. "They're cutting line," Jax said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Out in the blackness of space, a synchronized flash of brilliant, blinding blue light erupted. One by one, the magnificent warships of the Aurelian monarchy disappeared into the dimensional rifts. The High Chancellor, the generals, the noble houses, they had packed their wealth into their vaults and jumped system before the first dropship even touched the ground. They were running away, leaving their world to turn to ash. A massive shockwave suddenly hit Landing Bay 9G, harder than any before it. The overhead lights in the cockpit flickered out, placed instantly by the pulsing amber glow of the emergency backup systems. Jax felt a cold, bitter knot tighten in his gut. It wasn't his war. He was a cargo pilot. His cargo holds were packed to the brim with 500 tons of industrial silicate. His only responsibility was to keep his own skin intact. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the primary thruster ignition levers, but before his fingers could pull the levers back, a deafening metallic shriek tore through the atmosphere directly above his landing sector. It was the distinct, unmistakable howl of a high-performance atmospheric engine undergoing a violent, catastrophic failure. Jax glanced at the rear-facing external optical feeds, just in time to see a long, elegant streak of white and silver metal cut through the dark smoke clouds. It was a Royal Atmospheric Yacht, sleek, completely unarmed luxury craft used exclusively to transport members of the High Court. The luxury craft clipped the reinforced upper edge of the bay's concrete crane structure, shattering structural steel, like glass, before spinning out of control and slamming violently into the landing tarmac of Bay 10G, directly adjacent to Jax's ship. The sheer force of the impact shook the Iron Vanguard so hard that Jax was thrown violently forward against his chest harness. The ship's automated proximity alarms began to blare a rhythmic, low-pitched warning. Jax sat perfectly still in his seat for 3 long seconds, his right hand still hovering mere inches away from the main engine ignition. The logical choice was clear. The smart play was to pull the levers, ignite the primary fusion cores, blow the manual override on the hangar doors, and burn hard for the upper atmosphere before the vol established an impenetrable net. He owed absolutely nothing to whoever was inside that luxury craft. "Son of a BCH," Jax growled under his breath. It was a soft, disgusted sound. He reached down, unbuckled his safety harness with a sharp snap, and stood up. He grabbed a heavy-duty plasma cutter and a military-grade trauma kit, ready to face whatever nightmare lay waiting in Landing Bay 10G. Jax sprinted down the heavy steel boarding ramp of the Iron Vanguard, his movements surprisingly rapid for a man of his immense size. In his right hand, he carried a heavy-duty, industrial plasma cutter, brutal tool meant for shearing through thick structural bulkheads in a military grade. Trauma kit slapped against his thigh. The moment his boots hit the exterior hangar deck, the sheer hostility of the world outside threatened to buckle his knees. The air was a suffocating soup of pulverized permacy dust, vaporized hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, toxic stench of burning starship fuel. He coughed violently, pulling the thick, grease-stained collar of his leather flight jacket over his mouth and nose as he navigated the rapidly growing debris field that separated his bay from Landing Bay 1OG. The Royal Atmospheric Yacht was an absolute disaster. Its elegant anti-gravity repulsor engines were whining in a high-pitched, agonizing death rattle, desperately trying to lift a chassis that had been physically twisted into a sickening, irregular shape by the impact. The port-side engine assembly was nothing but a mangled mess of white-hot slag, and aggressive secondary fires were already licking across the pristine pearl-white hull plating. The golden emblem of the Aurelian royal house, emblazoned on the side of the vessel, was scorched black and peeling away in melted strips. Jax approached the wreckage cautiously, his heavy boots crunching over shattered fragments of silver-tipped wings. "Hey," he bellowed, his deep voice fighting against the distant, rhythmic thuds of the Lorbit artillery strikes. "Anyone breathing in there?" There was no immediate answer, only the ominous crackle of spreading electrical fires and the hiss of ruptured coolant lines. He scrambled onto the crushed structural frame of the ship's wing, his boots slipping momentarily on a slick trail of synthetic engine oil, and made his way toward the primary passenger hatch. The reinforced luxury door was buckled severely inward, its intricate electronic locking mechanisms completely shattered and fused together by the heat. Jax didn't waste time on finesse. He thumbed the ignition on his industrial plasma cutter. The blue-white thermal blade flared to life with an angry, vicious hiss that cut through the dust-choked air. He slammed the blade straight into the heavy, locking hinges, sparks showering over his leather jacket as he sheared through the military-grade alloy. With a harsh, heavy kick from his iron-capped boot, the heated metal door groaned, broke free from its frame, and fell inward with a resounding metallic thud. Thick, black smoke billowed out of the opening like a physical wave. Jax stepped into the cabin, waving his heavy hand to clear his field of vision. The interior was a total slaughterhouse. 2 elite royal guards, clad in their ornate, polished crimson armor, lay completely motionless near the front bulkhead, their bodies thrown violently forward by the extreme kinetic deceleration of the crash. "Is someone there?" The voice was incredibly small, trembling with raw terror, and it originated from the deep shadows at the very rear of the cabin. Jax stepped over the fallen guards, pulling a high-powered handheld lumen from his belt and casting its beam through the thick gloom. Huddled in the far corner, trapped beneath a massive, collapsed section of the luxury synthwood seating framework, was a young woman. She looked no older than 19. She was wearing a grand, formal court gown once, a brilliant, radiant emerald green, but now torn to shreds, blackened by soot, and heavily stained with crimson blood. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead by a thick sweat, but her eyes wide, terrified, and a piercing, vibrant shade of blue locked onto his flashlight beam with desperate intensity. You're not the Royal Guard," she whispered, coughing violently as the thick smoke began to settle into the lower levels of the compartment. "Observation skills are top-notch, kid," Jax muttered, dropping his heavy frame into a kneel beside her. He quickly inspected the thick metal support beam, pinning her lower legs against the floor plates. The structural alloy was incredibly dense, but the impact had fractured its main mounting brackets. "Hold completely still." Jax wedged his broad shoulders directly beneath the heavy metal beam. He gritted his teeth, the thick veins on his neck and forehead bulging dangerously as he drove his legs downward and pushed upward with every ounce of raw, unrefined strength he possessed. The metal ground in protest. "Pull your legs out. Now," he barked through his teeth. The girl scrambled backward frantically, gasping in sudden pain as she dragged her legs clear of the crushing weight. Jax let the massive beam drop with a heavy, echoing crash and exhaled a long, ragged breath. He reached into his trauma kit, tossed her a pressurized medical bandage, and shone the lumen over her body. "Are you broken anywhere? Can you stand?" "I think my right ankle is severely sprained." "Nothing feels broken," she said, her voice shaking so hard she could barely form the words. She clutched the bandage tightly, her hands trembling like leaves in a storm. She looked up at him, suddenly trying to pull together a fragile veneer of royal authority that was entirely unconvincing given her state. "I am Princess Aurelia. Aurelia Vance. You must contact the fleet command on the primary encryption channel immediately. Tell them my extraction transport was intercepted by Vol fighters before we could reach the upper orbital gate." Jax stared down at her, his weathered face completely blank. Princess Aurelia, the youngest daughter of the reigning emperor. He was looking at the crown princess of the entire fallen sector. "Look around you, Your Highness," Jax said, his voice flat, completely devoid of any royal deference or respect. "The comms towers are slag. The planetary network is dead." "Then take me directly to your ship," Aurelia demanded, her voice rising in an octave of pure panic as the reality of the situation began to pierce her shock. "You are a freight pilot. You must possess a long-range subspace transmitter. My father is waiting for my arrival in the high orbit. The Imperial flagship will deploy a heavy Vanguard retrieval team the moment they receive my coordinates." Jax felt a sudden, fleeting surge of dark pity for her, quickly followed by a sharp, burning stab of intense irritation. "Your father isn't in orbit, Princess." Aurelia blinked, the soot on her face making her blue eyes look unnaturally bright. What do you mean?" "I was watching the orbital telemetry feeds exactly 5 minutes ago inside my cockpit," Jax said brutally, showing zero desire to sugarcoat the truth. "The Third Royal Fleet spooled their slipspace drives and jumped the system. They didn't leave a single cruiser behind. They didn't deploy a single rescue pod. They are gone. They ran." "You're lying," Aurelia screamed, her voice cracking as it echoed off the ruined interior walls of the yacht. Thick tears finally cut clear tracks through the black soot on her cheeks. "He wouldn't leave me. We had an absolute evacuation protocol. My ground convoy was simply delayed by the civilian rioting at the spaceport gates. He is waiting for me." "They left," Jax repeated, his voice dropping into a quieter, harsher register. He didn't have the luxury of time or the emotional capacity to manage a royal breakdown, while an alien empire was actively conquering the soil beneath his feet. "I'm sorry, kid, but right now we have exactly 2 minutes before the Vol atmospheric ground forces sweep this entire sector and put kinetic slug through anything that's still breathing. So, you have a very simple choice. You can sit in this burning metal coffin and wait for a father who isn't coming back, or you can get your royal self up and follow me right now." Aurelia stared at him, the heavy, undeniable weight of his words crashing into her fragile reality. The denial in her eyes fought a brief, brutal internal war against her base survival instincts and lost. She nodded a sharp, jerky, terrified motion. Jax didn't hesitate. He reached down, grabbed her arm, and hauled her straight up to her feet. She hissed in agony as her weight settled onto her injured right ankle, her balance instantly faltering. "Lean on me," he commanded, catching her before she could hit the deck. They stumbled out of the smoking wreckage, hitting the shattered tarmac of the hangar bay just as the sky directly above landing bay, Kenji, split completely open. A Vol Dominion dropshipper, massive, asymmetrical wedge of dark, unpolished iron punched violently through the low-hanging smoke clouds. It didn't bother to land. It simply hovered 50 feet above the deck, its side mechanical base sliding open with a heavy screech. Dozens of heavily armored insectoid infantry figures began to fast rope down toward the spaceport. "Move," Jax roared. Jax half-carried, half-dragged Princess Aurelia across the open, cratered expanse between landing bay 10G and his own hangar. The first wave of Vol infantry hit the tarmac with a heavy, chitinous thud and immediately opened fire. Vicious streaks of jagged red plasma bolts hissed through the air, superheating the ambient moisture in the hangar and leaving thick, glowing trails of ionized gas in their wake. One plasma bolt slammed into the reinforced concrete pillar barely a foot to Jax's left, exploding in a shower of white-hot rock fragments and stinging dust. Aurelia screamed, her grip on Jax's jacket tightening in pure terror as she stumbled. Jax didn't slow his pace for a fraction of a second. He hooked his massive arm tightly around her waist, hoisted her completely off her feet, and carried her like a heavy sack of industrial grain. He sprinted, his heavy boots pounding against the vibrating metal floor plates, his lungs burning from the toxic air. Opened the primary bay doors, manually override. Jax bellowed into the wristcom, integrated into his gauntlet. The Iron Vanguard's basic automation system, an unglamorous subroutine he called blocker, complied instantly. The massive, segmented steel hangar doors of Bay 9G began to slide apart with a slow, grinding screech. Jax dove through the narrowing gap just as a concentrated volley of plasma fire melted the outer edges of the heavy metal frame, turning the steel into dripping red slag. He hit the industrial boarding ramp of his freighter hard, throwing Aurelia inside onto the metal deck before scrambling up behind her. He slammed his closed fist into the emergency slap switch on the bulkhead. The heavy hydraulic ramp retracted with a solid, pressurized thud, locking into place and temporarily cutting off the terrifying sounds of the alien invasion outside. Jax didn't pause to catch his breath or check his vitals. He grabbed Aurelia by the thick fabric of her ruined green dress and hauled her toward the front elevator shaft. "Get yourself into the co-pilot seat and strap into the harness," he yelled, shoving her toward the cockpit access door. "Do not touch a single switch unless I tell you to." He threw his massive frame into the main pilot's seat. Outside the ship, the Iron Vanguard's thick cargo bay doors were already beginning to glow a dangerous cherry red color as the Vol infantry troops outside began deploying heavy-duty kinetic breaching charges against the hull. "Blocker. Purge all non-essential life support to the lower cargo decks," Jax commanded, his large fingers flying across the crude manual console with frantic precision. "Divert every single watt of power from the auxiliary cells directly into the primary chemical thrusters in the forward structural integrity fields." The ship's flat, synthesized automated voice chimed through the console speakers with maddening calmness. "Warning. Atmospheric ascent protocols are currently incomplete. Risk of structural hull failure during maximum acceleration exceeds 40%. I don't care about the numbers. Just light the damn fuse." Jax screamed, slamming both of his palms against the primary ignition throttles. The Vol breaching charges on the hangar doors detonated with a concussive roar. The massive shockwave ripped through landing bay 9G, blowing the heavy steel doors inward like jagged pieces of shrapnel. Dust, smoke, and pressurized fire flooded the chamber, but Jax had already slammed the throttles forward to absolute maximum. The Iron Vanguard didn't gracefully lift off or drift away like the elegant anti-gravity royal cruisers. She roared like a dying beast. The twin chemical fusion drives ignited with a concussive, subterranean boom that literally cracked the spaceport's tarmac surface. A massive column of blue-white atomic fire slammed into the hangar floor, instantly vaporizing the concrete structures and melting the Vol soldiers who had just breached the perimeter. The intense G-force hit the cockpit like a physical blow from a gravity hammer. Aurelia was pressed violently back into her worn leather seat, her wide blue eyes staring at the ceiling. Her mouth open in a completely silent scream as the acceleration tore the breath from her lungs. Jax fought through the crushing weight pressing against his own chest. His thick arms locked onto the massive dual yoke with an iron grip. The heavy freighter tore straight through the reinforced roof of the landing bay, shattering structural steel support beams and sending a massive shower of burning debris raining down on the crumbling structures of the city below. They broke cleanly into the open, smoke-filled sky of Solis Prime. The capital world was an absolute graveyard from this height. Massive plumes of thick, black soot stretched for thousands of miles across the continents, turning what should have been a bright afternoon sky into a suffocating, unnatural twilight. Radar contact detected, Blocker announced through the static-choked comms. 2 Vol interceptors, moving on high-velocity intercept trajectory. Jax glanced toward the auxiliary tactical display on his right. 2 sleek, angular, arrowhead-shaped alien fighters were diving toward them from the upper stratosphere at Mach 4. They were incredibly fast-way too agile for a lumbering bulk freighter to outrun or outmaneuver in an atmospheric chase. Can we fight them? Aurelia gasped, her voice strained as she struggled to speak against the heavy atmospheric compression. Do we have laser batteries? With what, Princess? Harsh language. Jax grunted, jerking the heavy yoke hard to the left. The Iron Vanguard groaned in agonizing protest, its interior hull rivets popping under the sudden structural strain. We're a flying brick. We don't carry military railguns. The lead Vol interceptor fired. A concentrated volley of red plasma torpedoes streaked through the dark clouds directly toward the freighter's massive engines. Jax didn't try to dodge the incoming fire. Instead, he slammed the secondary thrusters into a brutal burst burn while simultaneously pitching the freighter's blunt nose straight up toward the stars. The massive ship shuddered with a violent, bone-rattling vibration as it completely stalled out in midair. The plasma torpedoes screamed past their lower underbelly, missing their hull plates by mere meters, and detonated harmlessly in the thick cloud layers far below them. Blocker. Open cargo bay doors 3 and 4 immediately. Jax yelled through his headset. Warning. Opening heavy cargo doors during high velocity. Atmospheric flight will result in the immediate and total loss of the onboard payload. Do it now. Jax roared. The heavy, mechanical sliding doors on the flat underside of the star freighter screeched open against the rushing atmospheric winds. Purge the magnetic locks on all secondary mineral containers. Jax ordered. Instantly, 80 tons of unrefined, high-density industrial silicate crates fell out of the ship's open belly. The massive steel shipping boxes tumbled erratically into the high-speed slipstream behind the freighter. The second Vol interceptor, flying right on their tail and preparing for a fatal strafing run, had absolutely zero time to react to the sudden kinetic hazard. The sleek, fragile alien fighter smashed headfirst into a tumbling 20-ton crate of dense mineral ores at Mach 2. The alien interceptor vanished instantly in a spectacular, blinding explosion of orange fire and twisted metal scrap. One down, Jax breathed, his face dripping with sweat as he pushed the primary throttles back to maximum power. Hold onto your crown, Princess. We're breaking the upper atmosphere. Asterisk, and just like that, Jax used a raw cargo drop to obliterate an elite alien interceptor. But the real nightmare is only beginning. If you're loving this raw human grit, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the upcoming twists. The smoky gray sky outside the cockpit glass transitioned rapidly into a deep, bruised purple, and then, with a sudden, silent finality, into the stark, star-speckled blackness of the open void. But there was absolutely no relief to be found in the silence of space. The orbital lanes above Solis Prime had been turned into a massive, drifting graveyard. Fragments of the shattered Imperial defense arrays floated everywhere, treacherous, spinning minefield of twisted silver hull plates, shattered solar sails, and frozen clouds of escaped engine coolant. And looming directly beyond this massive debris field lay the teeth of the invasion. 4 massive Vol Dominion dreadnoughts hung in the dark like jagged iron mountains, their primary weapon batteries glowing with an ominous, lethal red intensity. They have a hard target lock on us, Aurelia said, her voice dropping into a breathless whisper as she stared terrified at the rapid array of red, blinking indicators flashing across her co-pilot console. "Jax, they are actively targeting our drive signatures." "I see them, Princess," Jax said, his large hands slick with sweat as he gripped the heavy control yoke. He was calculating flight vectors completely in his head now, relying on pure, unadulterated survival instinct rather than the ship's damaged navigation computers. "Blocker, spool up the primary slipspace core. I need a directional jump solution right this second." The freighter's automated system chimed back with a low, distorted buzz. "Processing. Heavy spatial interference from the burning orbital debris field is severely delaying the jump matrix computation. Don't bother calculating a safe coordinate route." Jax roared back, his voice echoing off the metallic walls of the cabin. "Just point the nose toward deep space and punch a hole in the fabric." The remaining Vol interceptor, having finally recovered from Jax's improvised cargo drop in the upper stratosphere, broke through the thermosphere directly behind them. It locked its targeting arrays instantly onto the Iron Vanguard's massive, unshielded thermal signature. "Warning. Enemy missile lock detected," Blocker intoned. "Come on." "Just a few more seconds," Jax muttered under his breath, weaving the lumbering 50,000-ton freighter through the floating, mangled wreckage of a destroyed Imperial cruiser. He intentionally scraped the underbelly of his ship against a severed solar panel, the horrific metallic screech of tearing alloy echoing violently through the cockpit. The radical maneuver broke the alien interceptor's direct line of sight for a fraction of a second. The Vol fighter fired two heavy, anti-ship plasma missiles that streaked through the void, trailing thick lines of white exhaust gas. "Slip space drive, fully spooled," Blocker chimed. "Ready for immediate dimensional tear. Engage." Jax roared, slamming his massive palm down onto the primary execution lever. The universe outside the viewport warped instantly. The distant stars stretched out into infinitely long, brilliant streaks of blinding white light. A deep, booming sound, like low thunder echoing underwater, resonated through the entire structural frame of the freighter as the Iron Vanguard tore a violent hole in the fabric of real space and vaulted headfirst into the slipstream. The two alien missiles detonated on the rapidly closing rift, a futile burst of fire that washed harmlessly over the freighter's aft kinetic shields, just as they crossed the dimensional threshold. Then, suddenly, there was an absolute, overwhelming silence. The violent shaking of the hull stopped completely. The deafening roar of the chemical engines faded away into a low, steady, comforting, mechanical hum. The blinding, chaotic lights of the planetary battle were replaced by the swirling, hypnotic, blue and purple tunnel of the slipstream. Jax sat perfectly rigid in his seat, his large hands still gripping the heavy yoke so tightly that his knuckles had turned completely white. Slowly, he let out a long, ragged breath, allowing the massive buildup of adrenaline to drain out of his exhausted muscles. He turned his head slightly to look at Aurelia. The crown princess of the Alien Empire was pressed flat back into her worn leather seat, her wide blue eyes staring blankly at the swirling colors of the slipspace tunnel reflecting off the glass. She looked incredibly small, almost swallowed up by the oversized, grease-stained pilot's chair. As the immediate danger of death faded, the raw, crushing reality of what had just happened in the span of a single afternoon finally caught up to her. Her home world was ruined. Her empire was shattered. Her family had abandoned her to the flames. She was entirely, completely alone in the dark. Slowly, she brought her trembling hands up to her face, and for the very first time since Jax had pulled her from the smoking wreckage of her yacht, she began to cry. It wasn't a loud, theatrical sob of royal distress. It was the quiet, broken, hollow weeping of a child who had lost everything she had ever known. Jax watched her for a silent moment. He didn't offer any empty platitudes. He didn't tell her that everything was going to be all right, because he honestly didn't know if it would be. He was just a low-tier rim hauler with a severely damaged ship, limited fuel reserves. and the most dangerous, high-value target in the entire galaxy, sitting right next to him in his co-pilot seat. He had just painted a target on his back the size of a gas giant, and he knew he would be actively hunted by the Vol Dominion, and likely by what was left of the Royal Fleet if they ever crawled out of their holes. He unbuckled his safety harness, the metallic click sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet cockpit. He reached into a small manual storage compartment beneath his control seat, pulled out a somewhat clean coursework rag, and tossed it gently into her lap. "Wipe your face, kid," Jax said, his deep voice surprisingly gentle, rough like coarse sandpaper, but rock steady. "We've got an incredibly long way to go." Aurelia looked down at the rough cloth in her lap, then up at him, her vibrant blue eyes rimmed with dark red lines. Where are we even going?" Jax leaned back into his chair, looking out at the endless, swirling expanse of the dimensional tunnel. He cracked his thick knuckles, a cynical, tired half-smile pulling at the very corner of his mouth. "Anywhere but here, princess. Anywhere but here." The Iron Vanguard violently tore its way back into real space with a horrific structural groan. There was no graceful deceleration, no smooth transition from the swirling dimensional slipstream into the vacuum of normal space. The heavy, overburdened freighter simply dropped out of the dimensional tier like a stone hitting concrete. The ship's internal inertial dampeners shrieked in absolute protest, failing completely for a terrifying split second. The resulting physical backlash threw Jax violently forward against his chest harness, rattling his teeth and driving every last bit of air from his lungs. Beside him, Princess Aurelia violently expelled the contents of her stomach into a rusted metal maintenance bucket that Jax had blindly shoved into her lap mere seconds before they exited the rift. Red warning indicators bathed the entire cockpit in a harsh, pulsing, rhythmic glow. The primary control console sounded like a dying animal, emitting a chaotic chorus of high-pitched electronic alarms and low synthesized groans. Wisps of thick gray smoke, smelling strongly of melting copper wires and burnt engine ozone, began to curl slowly from the overhead ventilation grills. Jax unbuckled his harness, his large hands shaking slightly from the sudden adrenaline crash. He killed the main alarms with a harsh, heavy slap to the master control board, plunging the cabin into a heavy silence that pressed against the thick hull plates like deep water. "Car," Jax rasped, coughing heavily into his fist to clear his throat. "Status report," the freighter's automated voice replied, its artificial calmness standing in stark, unsettling contrast to the flashing red screens around them. "Primary fusion drives are completely offline. The slipspace motivator core is critically overheated, with coolant line ruptures detected in sectors 3 and 4. Internal life support systems are stable, but degraded at 72% capacity. We are currently drifting in the Vesper Traverse." Jax wiped a grease-stained hand across his face, smearing thick soot across his weathered cheek. The Vesper Traverse. It was a well-known cosmic graveyard of dead stars, cold rogue asteroids, and forgotten debris fields. It was completely empty, perpetually dark, and most importantly, was entirely off the main commercial trade and military warp routes. He looked over at Aurelia. The princess of the Alien Empire was slumped heavily against the side of her seat, clutching the rusted metal bucket with white-knuckled fingers. Her breathing was ragged and uneven. The once brilliant emerald silk of her formal gown was completely ruined, scorched by plasma fire and stained with her own sickness. She looked up at him, her vibrant blue eyes completely hollow, stripped of every ounce of the royal command she had tried to wield back in the hangar deck. Are they following us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the auxiliary generators. "Not yet," Jax said, unspooling a thick diagnostic cable from the overhead panel and plugging it directly into his portable datapad. "The slipspace wake we left behind was an absolute mess because of that blind jump. It'll take the Vol tracking ships a few hours to filter the localized telemetry and figure out our exact exit vector. But make no mistake, Ed, they'll figure it out. They always do. Aurelia swallowed hard, wiping her mouth with the back of her trembling, soot-stained hand. She turned her head to stare out the primary front viewport. There was absolutely nothing to see. No burning cities, no glorious golden fleets, no signs of civilization, just the cold, indifferent, endless blackness of deep space, dotted with distant, uncaring stars that offered no warmth. "We need to send an immediate distress signal," she said, her voice gaining a small fraction of its former aristocratic strength as she tried to find her footing. "We must broadcast to the core worlds, to my father's loyal allies in the Sovereign Coalition. If we broadcast my High Royal cipher on an open emergency frequency, they will deploy an elite strike force to retrieve us." Jax didn't even look up from his datapad, his fingers methodically scrolling through lines of diagnostic code. "No. What do you mean, no?" Aurelia demanded, sitting up straighter in her oversized seat, her royal pride flaring through her terror. "I am the daughter of the Emperor. I represent the sacred throne of Aurelia. You are nothing but a civilian freight pilot. I am officially ordering you to open a long-range communications channel right now." Jax stopped punching commands into his pad. He let the device drop heavily into his lap and turned his head slowly to look at her. His expression wasn't angry or aggressive. It was worse. It was profoundly tired. It was the look of a weathered man who had spent his entire life explaining the harsh, unforgiving realities of the universe to people who lived in ivory towers built on the backs of others. "Listen to me, Princess," Jax said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly rumble that filled the small cabin. "And listen to me very closely, because I am only going to explain the raw math of the realm to you exactly once. The Vol Dominion didn't just casually attack your planet. They crippled your entire orbital defense network in less than 10 minutes. They bypassed your multi-billion credit planetary shields like they were made of thin paper. And your father, the man who possesses the largest, most expensive golden military fleet in this entire sector, took one look at those Iron Dreadnoughts and ran straight for the core." Aurelia flinched violently, as if his words had been a physical blow across her face. He was securing the continuity of the government. He was making a strategic tactical retreat to gather heavy reinforcements from the inner rings. "He abandoned you," Jax said with brutal, unvarnished honesty. "He hated being the one to tear down her world, but he absolutely needed her grounded in reality, not fairy tales. If she panicked or tried to interfere with the ship's systems, she would get them both killed in the dark. He left billions of ordinary people to burn so he could save his own skin and his chests of credits. If we broadcast your High Royal cipher out here in the dark, the Sovereign Coalition isn't going to hear it first. The Vol long-range sensors are going to pick it up instantly, and then they are going to warp in here, rip this unarmored freighter apart piece by piece just to put you in a cage, and put a high-velocity plasma bolt through my skull for the trouble." He picked his datapad back up, his pale gray eyes scanning the scrolling lines of red error text. "So, there are no distress signals. There are no royal edicts. There is no throne anymore," Jax finished, standing up from his seat and grabbing a heavy, industrial tool belt from the wall bulkhead. "From here on out, you aren't a princess. You're just cargo, and my only job is keeping the cargo intact until I can find a safe port to drop you off." Aurelia stared at him, her mouth opening and closing completely silently. For a brief second, Jax thought she might scream, throw a royal tantrum, or strike him. Instead, she looked down at her small, trembling hands. The final bit of fight left her posture, leaving behind only a crushing, silent, suffocating grief. "I have to go down to the lower engineering bay," Jax said, softening his gruff tone by just a fraction as he adjusted the heavy tool belt around his waist. "I need to manually patch the secondary coolant lines, or the slip space drive core is going to literally melt through the ship's bottom hull. Do not touch the control console. Do not leave this cabin under any circumstances." He didn't wait for her response. He turned his back, walked out of the cockpit, let the heavy metal pneumatic doors slide shut behind him, leaving Princess Aurelia entirely alone in the blinking amber twilight of the bridge. The engineering bay of the Iron Vanguard was a claustrophobic nightmare of exposed titanium pipes, dusted metal walkways, and heavy, roaring machinery. It was sweltering hot, without the primary coolant circulating through the system. The residual thermal energy from the main sublight engines was baking the lower decks like an oven. Jax stripped off his heavy leather flight jacket, tossing it over a grease-stained railing, and crawled directly under the massive, cylindrical housing of the damaged slipspace motivator core. The space was incredibly tight. He had to violently contort his broad, thick shoulders just to reach the ruptured pressure valve located near the back. Thick, viscous blue engine coolant was pooling heavily on the floor plates beneath him, hissing loudly as it made contact with the white-hot metal of the main engine block. Blocker. Isolate the secondary flow immediately, Jax grunted, wrenching a heavy hydraulic spanner onto a stripped, smoking bolt, slating secondary flow lines. The AI replied with its flat drone. The violent hissing of the escaping gas slowed down significantly. But it didn't stop completely. Jax swore softly under his breath. He flipped the ignition switch on his industrial plasma torch, the brilliant, blinding blue flame instantly illuminating his sweat-drenched, grease-streaked face. He had to manually weld a thick alloy patch plate directly over the rupture while the main pipe was still scorching hot. It was incredibly dangerous, sloppy work. One single slip of his hand, and the highly pressurized chemical line would blow out, taking his entire face off in a fraction of a second. Time completely lost its meaning in the cramped, stifling darkness of the lower deck. Jax worked with a grim, mechanical, unyielding rhythm. He forced himself not to think about the burning jewel world they had left behind. He forced himself not to think about the broken girl weeping in his co-pilot seat. He focused entirely on the metal, the blinding heat, and the precision of the weld. Do you need any help down here? Jax jumped violently, banging the back of his skull incredibly hard against the dense iron engine housing. He cursed loudly at the sudden pain, dropping the heavy plasma torch in surprise. It clattered sharply through the floor grates and automatically extinguished itself. He slid out from beneath the structural housing, rubbing the back of his head angrily. Princess Aurelia was standing directly at the bottom of the rusty access ladder. She looked like an absolute ghost in the dim, pulsing, amber emergency lighting of the engineering bay. She had used a loose piece of copper wire to tie her dark hair tightly back from her face to keep it out of her eyes. More shockingly, that she had taken a rugged, survival knife from the bridge's emergency kit and completely hacked off the bottom half of her ruined emerald court gown. It now hung unevenly and jaggedly just above her bare knees, finally allowing her to walk through the ship's tight corridors without constantly tripping over the heavy, delicate silk. In her small, trembling hands, she held a battered metal canteen. "I explicitly told you to stay on the bridge," Jax said, his tone incredibly sharp, his irritation flaring. "The main alarms stopped echoing," Aurelia said quietly, her voice steadying as she stepped closer. "And the environmental readouts on my console said the internal temperature down here was exceeding 42 degrees Celsius. I brought you water." Okay. She held out the dented canteen toward him. Her hands were still shaking slightly from residual shock, but her chin was raised high. It wasn't an act of royal defiance or unearned arrogance. It was a desperate human attempt to be useful in a universe that had suddenly stripped her of everything else. Jax stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He let out a long, defeated sigh, wiping the thick black grease from his hands onto his dark trousers, and took the canteen from her. The water inside was lukewarm and tasted faintly of old iron pipe, but to Jax, it was the best thing he had ever swallowed. He drained half of the canteen in one single go, then wiped his wet mouth with the back of his calloused forearm. "Thanks," he muttered grumpily, setting the canteen down. He sat down heavily on a reinforced storage crate, his exhausted muscles screaming in immediate protest. Aurelia hesitated for a second, then sat down directly on the cold, greasy, grated floor plates a few feet away from him, pulling her bare knees tightly against her chest to stay warm in the shifting drafts. For a long time, the only sound filling the engineering bay was the low, rhythmic, subterranean thrum of the freighter's auxiliary power core and the sharp pinging of cooling metal plates. "I checked the upper galley storage lockers," Aurelia said, finally, her quiet voice breaking the heavy silence of the room. "There are only synthetic protein rations in there. They taste like chalk." Jax let out a short, dry, hollow laugh. "Welcome to the real Rim, kid. We don't exactly dine on roasted syntax, fowl, or imported nectar out here on a freight run. It keeps your heart beating. That's all it's ever meant to do." Aurelia looked down through the floor grates, watching the dark oil drop into the bilge below. "Why did you actually do it?" she asked softly, her blue eyes looking up to meet his gray ones. "Why did you save me, Jax? You could have launched the Iron Vanguard the exact millisecond my yacht crashed into the tarmac. You didn't have to stay behind. You didn't have to cut me out of that metal." Jax leaned his heavy head back against the structural bulkhead, closing his eyes in the dim light. "Pure reflex," he lied smoothly. "Or raw stupidity. Take your pick." "I don't believe you," Aurelia said instantly, her gaze piercing right through his defensive exterior. Jax opened his eyes slowly. He looked at her. Really looked at her. She was a child of extreme imperial privilege, raised in glittering crystal palaces that cost more than the annual gross domestic product of entire Rim star systems. But right now, stripped entirely of her royal guards, her fancy titles, and her soft illusions. She was just a terrified 19-year-old kid trying to understand a brutal universe that had suddenly turned completely inside out on her. 10 years ago, Jax began, his voice dropping into a flat register, completely devoid of any artificial emotion. "I was running heavy supply lines to an imperial mining colony on a rock called Cinder Prime. Deep core mineral extraction. Absolute brutal, backbreaking work. The miners down there were forced to pay a crushing 80% imperial tax rate directly to the crown. Your father's taxes. They paid that money every single month so the crown could build that beautiful, shining golden Vanguard fleet to keep the sector safe from invaders." Aurelia watched him intently, her breath hitching slightly in her throat as she listened. "There was a massive, catastrophic seismic collapse in Sector 4, Jax continued, his eyes staring blankly at a dark spot on the wall far behind her head. Thousands of ordinary miners were instantly trapped deep underground. The local sector authorities sent a frantic emergency request for immediate heavy lift support and plasma drills to the Royal Imperial Garrison stationed exactly 1 star system over. They needed heavy mat ships. They needed industrial drills." "Stop speaking for a moment." He took a slow, deep, ragged breath. The Royal Garrison commander officially denied the request. He stated in his log that the colony hadn't met its monthly mineral yield quota, and moving crown military assets for a deficit world would be a misuse of royal resources. They left them all to suffocate, slowly, in the dark. My younger brother was in shaft for B. He was 19. Aurelia's hands flew to her mouth in absolute horror, her blue eyes wide. I never knew. Nobody ever told us." "Of course you didn't know, princess," Jax said, his deep voice dropping into a harsh, freezing whisper that cut through the heat of the bay. "You aren't supposed to know. The blood always washes off the gold before the credits ever reach the capital city. I watched your father's magnificent golden fleet run away today without firing a single shot. I watched them do to your world exactly what they did to Cinder Prime 10 years ago. They are cowards who hide behind silver shields." He stood up slowly, picking up his tools. "So when I saw your royal yacht go down, I don't know. Maybe I just wanted to steal something incredibly valuable from the exact man who stole everything from me. Or maybe Maybe I just couldn't stand to watch another 19-year-old die in the dark while the cowards ran away. Jax turned back toward the engine, his face hardening as he reignited his plasma torch. The drive core is patched. Go back to the bridge and strap in. We're about to find out if the Vol had found us. Suddenly, the overhead amber emergency lights didn't just flicker, they turned a solid, terrifying, unblinking shade of deep crimson. Blocker's voice boomed through the engineering speakers, distorted by heavy spatial static. Warning: multiple high-mass slip-space rifts detected within immediate proximity. 3 Vol Dominion hunter-destroyers have just dropped out of warp. They have established an active weapon lock on our position. Impact imminent. Jax's eyes met Aurelia's wide, terrified gaze in the crimson glow. The chase wasn't over. The real war for survival had just officially begun. Asterisk, the Vol destroyers have completely surrounded the Iron Vanguard. Their weapon lock is active. Can Jax and the princess survive this absolute death trap? Drop your best theories in the comments below. And subscribe to the channel right now with notifications turned on so you don't miss the next chapter of this epic journey.